Picture a night in late October, 1881, when the Missouri hills still carried the smell of pine tar and gunpowder from the war that refused to end. The moon hung low and red above the treeline, the color of fresh blood on snow, and the only sound was the creak of saddle leather as Sheriff Eliza Crow rode the narrow trace alone. 28 years old, black hair braided tight beneath her Stetson, a Colt on her hip and a warrant folded inside her coat. Folks back in town called her fearless. The Barrow brothers called her something else entirely. She never saw the rifle but that dropped her from the saddle. One moment the cold air stung her cheeks, the next, there was only darkness and the taste of iron where her teeth cut her tongue. When her eyes opened again, the world had shrunk to 4 stone walls sweating moisture, a single tin cup of water, and the weight of chains older than the Republic itself. Above her, floorboards groaned under heavy boots. 2 voices drifted down through the cracks, one soft, almost tender, the other low and laughing, the way a wolf laughs at a trap it already knows is empty. They spoke her name like they were tasting it, rolling it across their tongues the way a man tests the edge of a blade. 6 years, 2 months, and 11 days would pass before any living soul saw Eliza Crow again. 6 winters of breath freezing on the walls. 6 springs of distant thunder that shook loose dirt from the ceiling like grave dust. And every night, the same whispered promise from the darkness above. She's ours now, brother. The law herself belongs to us. Somewhere in those black woods, a mystery took root and grew teeth. They say if you walk the old trace at the right hour, when the wind moves wrong through the pines, you can still hear her, not screaming anymore, not pleading. Just a calm, steady voice counting the links of a chain that was never really broken. This is the story they never dared print in the county papers. This is what the trees remember when men forget. Listen close. The woods are speaking. In the spring of 1879, the little county seat of Pine Hollow, Missouri, was still raw from the war. Half the men limped, the courthouse roof leaked, and the jail had burned twice. When old Sheriff McAllister took a mini ball in the lung during a saloon fight and died coughing blood onto the sawdust floor, the town needed someone new fast. The county Democratic Committee wanted a safe pair of hands, preferably a Confederate veteran who could keep the freedmen in line and the bushwhackers out of the hills. Instead, the voters, many of them women who had kept farms running while their husbands shot at each other, gave them Eliza Jane Crow. She was 26, born on a hardscrabble ridge farm where her father taught her to read law books by pine knot light and her mother taught her to shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 100 yards. When Quantrill's raiders torched their place in '64, 12-year-old Eliza had hidden in a sinkhole with a Navy revolver and 7 cartridges, listening to her mother scream until the screaming stopped. She came out the next morning covered in ash, carrying her father's badge he'd worn as a Union militia captain. She kept that badge pinned inside every coat she ever owned afterward, like a splinter she refused to dig out. By 1879 she had spent 4 years riding deputy for McAllister, tracking horse thieves across 3 states and bringing them back alive when most men would have shot them off the saddle and called it justice. She never drank, never cursed, never raised her voice, but when she looked at a man over the barrel of her Colt, something cold and final moved behind her gray eyes and the hardest cases folded. The newspapers as far away as St. Louis called her the petticoat peacekeeper. The men who lost brothers at Centralia or Baxter Springs called her worse. Election day was a circus. Drunk veterans waved Confederate battle flags, freedmen stood quiet with their hats in their hands, women in sunbonnets lined up for the first time because Missouri had just granted them the school suffrage vote and they figured the ballot box was the ballot box. When the returns came in after midnight, Eliza Crow had beaten the committee's men by 93 votes. The next morning she walked into the courthouse, pinned both badges, her father's and the new tin star, to her vest, and told the clerk to swear her in before anyone had time to think better of it. The judge who administered the oath was so flustered he forgot half the words. Eliza supplied them from memory, voice steady, right hand raised. Outside, some cheered, some spat tobacco juice, and high in the pine ridges the Barrow brothers heard the news and began oiling the locks on a door nobody knew existed yet. November 1881 came in cold and early, the way it does when the Ozarks decide winter has waited long enough. Frost silvered the grass before dawn, and the creeks ran black under shelves of ice. Pine Hollow had settled into an uneasy quiet, the harvest was in, the stills were running, and the only trouble left was the usual kind, drunk men, loose horses, and the occasional knifing behind the livery. Sheriff Eliza Crow spent her days riding circuit, checking moonshine camps, breaking up card games that got too serious. Folks noticed she always took the high ridges alone now, as if the solitude agreed with her. On the 22nd of the month a federal marshal rode in from Springfield with a thick packet of warrants. Most were for small-time offenders, but 3 carried the names Reuben Barrow, Silas Barrow, and Lemuel Barrow, brothers who lived so far back in the hills that mail reached them only when someone felt like carrying it. The charges read like a catalogue of frontier sins: illicit distilling, assault on a revenue officer, suspicion of horse theft, and one darker line buried at the bottom: inquiry into the disappearance of travelers along the old wire road. The marshal wanted them alive if possible, dead if necessary, and he didn't much care who brought them. Eliza took the papers without comment, folded them into the inside pocket of her wool coat beside her father's old badge, and saddled the big line-back dun she called Justice. She told her deputy, a nervous boy named Willis Pike, that she'd be back by supper the next day. He asked if she wanted company. She said the trail was too narrow for 2 horses and too steep for excuses. At noon she rode out of Pine Hollow with her Winchester in the scabbard, a bedroll tied behind the cantle, and a quiet that sat on her shoulders like a hawk. The path climbed fast, leaving the cornfields and the smoke of chimneys behind. By mid-afternoon the pines closed overhead, their needles hushing every sound except the crunch of frost under iron-shod hooves. The air smelled of resin and wood smoke drifting from hidden stills. Once she passed an old woman gathering ginseng who crossed herself at the sight of a woman wearing a star. Eliza touched her hat brim and kept riding. Dusk found her high on the spine of Barrow Ridge, the sky bleeding out behind the treetops. Somewhere below, a dog barked once and was silenced. She loosened the colt on her hip, drew the warrant from her pocket, and read the brothers' names again by the last light, as if saying them aloud might make the men appear. The wind shifted, carrying the faint copper smell of fresh slaughter. She nudged Justice forward down the switchback trace that only the desperate or the damned ever used, the paper in her gloved hand crackling like dry leaves, the weight of 6,000 square miles of wilderness pressing in from every side. The first thing she felt was the cold, a wet, living cold that crawled inside her clothes and laid its fingers against the pulse in her throat. Then came the pain, a white-hot ring around her skull where the rifle butt had landed, and the duller, spreading ache of wrists wrenched behind her back. She tried to sit up and discovered she could not. Iron bit into her ankles, a chain, short and thick, ran from the leg irons to a staple driven deep into living stone. The air tasted of mold and coal oil and something sweeter, like apples left too long in a barrel. She was naked except for her combinations, boots gone, coat gone, the Colt and the Winchester and even her pocket knife taken. The badges were missing too. She felt the absence on her chest like a fresh burn. Darkness pressed so close she could not tell if her eyes were open or shut until a match flared somewhere above and behind her. In its sulfur bloom she saw the low ceiling of beams and clay, the sweating walls of a root cellar dug beneath a cabin floor. Jars of peaches and beans glimmered on shelves like blind eyes. Boot steps crossed the boards overhead, deliberate, unhurried. A trapdoor lifted with a groan of hinges that had not been oiled in years. Lantern light spilled down a set of ladder rungs and painted 2 silhouettes against the glow. The taller one carried the lantern, the shorter one held her own Colt loosely, as if he had been practicing the weight of it. "Evening, Sheriff," said the taller, voice soft as flannel soaked in kerosene. "You're a hard woman to invite to supper." The shorter one laughed, a sound like a hinge that needed grease. "Told you she'd ride straight in, Reuben. Proud as a gamecock." Eliza tested the chains. They answered with a dull clink that told her everything she needed to know about Hope. Blood crusted her hairline and ran warm into her collar. She swallowed once, tasted iron and pine needles, and forced her voice steady. "You've made your point, boys." Weeks slid into months, and the brothers began to speak freely above her, as though she were furniture that could not testify. They never used her name anymore. She was the law, or the badge, or simply her downstairs. Their voices drifted through the floorboards like smoke, sometimes quarreling, sometimes laughing in perfect harmony, and in those careless hours they laid bare the rot at the heart of their plan. Reuben, the older, the one with the soft voice and the patient hands, believed the world ran on invisible chains far stronger than iron. The war had proved it. Men marched to drums they never saw, killed for flags stitched by strangers, hanged for laws written in cities they would never visit. The law was not a man, not even a piece of paper. It was a spirit, a jealous god that wore tin stars and demanded blood tithes. And now they had caught that spirit in female flesh and dragged it underground. Silas, broader, quicker to rage, cared less for philosophy. He wanted revenge for every raid the revenue men had made on their stills, for every cousin hanged by vigilantes wearing deputy badges. But even he repeated the catechism Reuben had taught him: if you break the law's body long enough, the law itself loses its power over you. Kill a sheriff and another steps forward, chain the idea of the sheriff in the dark, feed it just enough to keep breathing, and every warrant in the country turns to ash. They told her this the way other men might recite scripture, while they lowered a tin plate of cornbread and fatback on a string, while they poured water into her cup with mock courtesy. Reuben would kneel at the edge of the trapdoor, lantern held high so she could see his mild, almost clerical smile. You represent something bigger than yourself, Eliza. That's why we can't just shoot you and be done. Shooting's too quick for symbols. Symbols have to suffer so the story gets told right. Sometimes he read aloud from a tattered copy of Blackstone's commentaries he had stolen from a courthouse fire, marking passages with a carpenter's pencil as though preparing a sermon. Silas preferred to clean her Colt in front of her, oiling the cylinders, spinning them slow so the clicks echoed like a heartbeat in the stone room. Night after night they reminded her that no posse was coming, that her deputy had chalked her absence up to a runaway horse or a sudden marriage or simple frontier indifference. They reminded her that the law she had sworn to uphold now lived in a hole, naked and stinking, dependent on the mercy of the very men it had once hunted. And in the long hours when the lantern was gone and only the red eyes of the cookstove glowed upstairs, she began to understand that they truly believed captivity could unmake justice itself, the way frost heaves a gravestone out of consecrated ground. Their madness was methodical, patient, almost tender, and it settled over her like a second set of chains no key on earth could ever open. The first winter taught her their rhythm. Reuben came down alone on even days, speaking gently, bringing an extra blanket when the cold bit hardest, wiping blood from her lip after Silas had lost his temper the night before. He called her Miss Eliza again, asked after her health as though she were a houseguest taken poorly, read her passages from the Bible or the St. Louis Republican he saved for her like treats. On odd days Silas descended with the lantern held low so the shadows leapt like devils, kicking over her slop bucket, pressing the cold barrel of her own Colt against her temple while he described, in wet detail, what he would do if she ever tried to scream when someone outside was near. They traded roles the way card sharps trade aces, never warning her which brother would open the trapdoor next. One morning she would wake to Reuben brushing dirt from her hair with his fingers, humming Lorena under his breath. That same evening Silas would drag her chain taut and burn the sole of her foot with a heated poker because supper had been late. After a while the kindness and the cruelty blurred until she caught herself thanking Silas for a cup of water and flinching when Reuben smiled. They kept her alive with calculated precision, never enough food to grow strong, never so little that fever took her. They shaved her head once when lice came, Reuben holding the lantern steady while Silas wielded the shearing knife, both of them murmuring that it was for her own good. They spoke of the world above as though it were a play performed for her benefit, the new president, the price of corn, the hanging of a horse thief in Fort Smith. Sometimes they lied deliberately, said her deputy had been killed, said the county had hired a man to replace her, watching her face for the fracture lines. The worst was when they stood together at the top of the ladder and argued about her the way farmers argue about a sick cow. Reuben insisting she still had value as a symbol, Silas claiming the sport was wearing thin. In those moments she became weightless, a thing suspended between mercy and the blade, unable to predict which voice would win until the trapdoor slammed and the lantern either descended or did not. Years began to lose their edges. She learned to sleep sitting up, to measure time by the changing smell of the earth, to answer to whichever version of reality they needed that day. The woman who had once stared down border ruffians over a gun barrel began to greet the softer brother with relief and the harder one with something perilously close to gratitude, because at least when Silas hurt her she knew where she stood in the world. The chains never changed, but the prison widened until it included every corner of her mind, and the brothers walked freely there, trading masks whenever her soul showed signs of settling on solid ground. Spring came late the second year, and with it the chickens. The brothers kept a small flock in a pen above the cellar, and every morning one of them scattered cracked corn across the packed dirt while the birds scratched and quarreled. The feed pan sat directly over a narrow crack between the floorboards, and through that crack fell treasures, feathers, grain dust, and, once or twice a week, a long thigh bone stripped clean by the cookpot. Eliza waited until the third spring to begin collecting them. She worked only when both brothers were gone to the still, which happened more often as the weather warmed and the mash needed tending. With her teeth and the jagged edge of a tin cup she whittled each bone thinner, testing its flex, hiding the shavings in her hair or swallowing them when footsteps crossed the floor above. When she had 6 good ones she bound them together with threads pulled from her blanket, fashioning a slender pick no longer than her forefinger. The leg irons were old, Union surplus from the war, the lock a crude square plate with a keyhole big enough to admit a squirrel. She practiced at night, lying on her side, wrist twisted until the joint sang, sliding the bone pick into the hole and feeling for the tumblers the way her father had once taught her to feel for trout beneath river stones. Weeks passed, the pick splintered, was replaced, splintered again. Each October 1884 brought the hardest rains anyone could remember. The creeks rose until they carried whole barns past the courthouse, and the trail up Barrow Ridge turned into a red sluice. A traveling preacher named Elias Goode, half-frozen and 3 days lost after his mule foundered, stumbled off the trace and into the clearing where the brothers' cabin squatted like a toad under the pines. Night was coming on fast, and the rain hissed on the tin roof loud enough to drown a scream. He beat on the door with the butt of his sodden Bible, begging shelter in the name of the Lord. Silas cracked the door, shotgun first, and might have sent him on if Reuben hadn't recognized the black frock coat and the white beard as harmless. They let him in, sat him by the stove, fed him cornbread and chicory coffee while he dripped on their puncheon floor. The preacher talked the way lonely men do when they finally find ears, about the flood, about the revival in Springfield, about voices he'd heard in the woods 2 nights running, faint as a child crying under the ground. Reuben's eyes flicked once to the rug that covered the trapdoor. Silas kept smiling with too many teeth. Goode said the sound had followed him for miles, rising and falling with the wind, a woman's voice counting something he couldn't make out. He thought at first it was a haunt, then maybe a lost traveler dying in a sinkhole. Either way, it chilled him worse than the rain. The brothers listened, nodding like Christians should, and when the preacher's cup was empty they walked him back to the door with gentle hands on his shoulders. Silas even gave him a lantern and a twist of tobacco for the road. They watched until the yellow light disappeared into the trees, then stood on the porch a long time listening to the rain drum on the leaves. Next morning, soaked to the soul and half delirious with fever, Elias Goode staggered into Pine Hollow and told his story to anyone who would buy him coffee. By noon a dozen men with rifles and dogs were beating the ridges, shouting Eliza Crow's name into every hollow. They found the preacher's tracks, found the place where he'd fallen and prayed, found a set of boot prints leading to the Barrow cabin and away again. But the rain had done its work, every scent was washed clean, every cry of sheriff came back mocked by its own echo. The posse rode within 50 yards of the hidden cellar door, close enough that Eliza, hearing boots on the roof of her world, screamed until her throat tore and her chains rattled like a deathwatch beetle. The men heard only water and wind. By nightfall they were back in town, calling Goode a liar drunk on visions and telling each other the sheriff had surely left years ago for California or a bullet. Above her, Reuben swept the floor clean of mud, hummed Rock of Ages, and slid the bolt home with a soft, forgiving click. The summer of 1886 was the hottest anyone could recall. Heat seeped through the floorboards and turned the cellar into a slow oven. Eliza's monthly bleeding stopped, then started again heavier than ever, and she understood before they did what was growing inside her. When her belly began to swell, the brothers noticed the way a man notices a new crack in his chimney, first with irritation, then with a kind of wondering greed. Reuben brought clean straw and a length of softer chain so she could lie on her side without the irons cutting to the bone. Silas stood over her for long minutes at a time, breathing through his mouth, eyes fixed on the curve beneath her shift as if it were a puzzle he had not expected to solve. They spoke less now, and when they did it was in short, practical sentences about milk and laudanum and whether the child would have her gray eyes or their mother's weak chin. Labor came on a night when thunder rolled down the ridge like artillery. The pain was enormous, endless, different from anything the poker or the whip had taught her. She bit through her lower lip to keep from crying out, blood filled her mouth with the taste of every battlefield she had never seen. Reuben knelt between her knees with his sleeves rolled high, murmuring encouragement the way he once murmured scripture, while Silas paced above and counted the minutes between lightning and thunder like a man timing a fuse. The child slid free just after midnight, slick and blue-tinged, a boy with a shock of black hair already wet against his skull. For one heartbeat the cellar held only the sound of a new mouth drawing air. Reuben wrapped the infant in a flour sack, tied the cord with baling twine, and lifted him toward the ladder before Eliza could reach. She lunged against the chains until the irons sawed skin to the bone, screaming a single word that was not a name yet but soon would be. Silas took the bundle without looking at her. The trapdoor shut. The bolt shot home. Footsteps crossed the floor, paused, crossed again. Then came the thin, reedy wail of a newborn rising through the boards like smoke through a chimney, farther and farther away until the storm swallowed it. They never brought the child down again. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she heard a second, smaller set of boots learning to walk overhead, the hesitant shuffle of someone who had never known sunlight on his face. They named him Caleb, after their dead father, and taught him to call them Papa Reuben and Papa C. When he asked about the scratching sounds under the floor, they told him it was rats, or the wind, or the devil chained in the old days of the war. Eliza lay in the dark and felt the absence where her son had been, a hollow larger than the cellar itself, and began for the first time to plan something worse than escape. January 1887 arrived with a thaw that fooled the redbuds into blooming too early. Then the sky cracked open and the rain came down in sheets thick enough to drown a man standing upright. Creeks turned into rivers, rivers into lakes, and the whole spine of Barrow Ridge began to slide downhill one slow inch at a time. For 3 days the brothers worked like demons, shoring the cabin with logs, digging trenches to carry the water away from the foundation, cursing the mud that sucked their boots off. On the fourth night the storm paused just long enough for the ground to remember how saturated it was, then struck again with a roar that shook the lantern on its nail. Eliza, thinner than fence wire and burning with the low fever that had lived in her bones since the birth, felt the first tremor travel through the stone floor like a warning. Dirt sifted from the ceiling in pale streams. Somewhere above, timber screamed and gave way. The hillside behind the cabin let go all at once. 100 tons of clay and pine and limestone peeled away from the ridge and thundered down the slope, taking half the back wall with it. Moonlight, real moonlight, poured into the cellar for the first time in 2,241 days, silvering the chains, the straw, the rusted bucket she had used for everything a human body must do. The trapdoor hung from one hinge like a broken jaw. She heard Silas shouting, Reuben praying, the boy Caleb crying somewhere in the wreckage. Then came the sound she had stopped believing in, other men's voices, distant but growing louder, lanterns bobbing through the storm as the flood carried word down country that the Barrow place had finally slid into hell. Eliza crawled. The leg irons caught on splintered beams, dragged her back, then snapped at the rivets weakened by 6 years of rust and her own patient scraping with a shard of tin. She left skin and part of herself on the rocks and kept moving, up the broken ladder, through the ruin of the kitchen where the stove lay on its side still ticking with heat. Rain lashed her face, the air tasted of pine and freedom and the iron stink of her own blood. Silas saw her first. He stood ankle-deep in mud, shotgun raised, eyes wild in the lightning. Behind him Reuben clutched the boy to his chest like a shield. For a moment the three of them and the storm were the only things left in the world. Then a rifle cracked from the tree line, and another, and the night filled with running men and barking dogs and the sudden, impossible sound of her own name shouted by voices that still remembered she had once worn a star. She took one more step into the rain and fell forward into the arms of strangers who smelled of tobacco and wet wool and disbelief.